Hello and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. Thank you for joining us for tonight's exciting event. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. This year, all of our events are virtual and virtually all of them are free. I'd like to take a moment to thank some of the sponsors and partners who made this year's festival possible. We'd like to thank the City of Spokane, Spokane Arts, Eastern Washington University, and the Literary Arts Emergency Fund for providing us with grant funding. We would also like to thank the Spokane chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, Must Read Fiction, North Idaho College, and Doma Coffee Roasting Company for their partnership and support. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you all for joining us for Creativity in the Climate Crisis. This reading features 3 critically acclaimed authors, Johanna Stoberock, Aimee Nezhukumatathil, and Wall Kimmerer, whose creative work brings awareness to the natural world and the increasingly pressing issue of climate change. We're thrilled to welcome all 3 authors into this virtual space with us tonight. Spokane's own Jewel Zeller will be helping us with introductions and will lead a conversation with the authors following their readings. If you're tuning in live, be sure to leave some questions for our authors in the chat. Before we hand it over to Maya, Kate will give her a brief introduction.
Thank you, Claire. Jewel Zeller is the author of the interdisciplinary collaboration with visual artist Carrie DeBacker, Alchemy for Cells and Other Beasts, the chapbook Yesterday the Bees, and the poetry collection Rustfish. Her prose appears in such places as Brevity, Bellingham Review, and Booth Journal. Recipient of a Promise Award from the Sustainable Arts Foundation, as well as a residency in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, Maya has presented her work internationally at the University of Oxford and in Madrid at the Unamuno Author Festival. Maya is an Associate Professor of English for Central Washington University and Poetry Editor for Scablands Books, and she is currently at work on a memoir called Raised by Ferns. Please welcome Maya.
Thanks, Kate and Claire. I'm grateful to be here tonight with 3 writers I deeply admire, whose work engages thoughtfully with our relationships to fellow creatures, plant and animal, and to the land on which we live. As we gather in this virtual space, I invite us all to reflect on whose ancestral lands we call home, and more than that, to support the work of Indigenous artists and writers. In Washington State, our Arts Commission recently named Rena Priest of the Lummi Nation as our state's first Indigenous Poet Laureate. Here in Spokane, we are fortunate to have the language efforts of the Salish School. These efforts empower stories like those we will hear tonight from Johanna, Aimee, and Robin, and they help engender creativity in a time of climate crisis, which is our event tonight. To get us started, here are 3 facts about climate crisis. 1, climate changes include rising sea levels, shrinking mountain glaciers, accelerating ice melt, and shifts in flower and plant blooming times. 2, most of the planet's ice cover will likely melt by the end of the century and trigger a cascade of irreversible consequences, including flooding strong enough to engulf entire cities. 3, in 2018, there were 14 extreme weather events that resulted in more than $1 billion in damages. These facts, ranging in how they are presented to us as shifts in aesthetic presentation to dangerous and costly disasters, are by now not alarming to most of us, nor, despite their urgency, do they make us rush to action. They don't inspire most of us to change daily habits or shift careers. So what does? Every day, I run or walk from my house down the trail that winds into the Little Spokane River Valley. This part of the river is cold and clear, fed by natural springs that gush from the hillside. I like to stop and touch the water to feel the inside of the earth. And I like knowing how, despite those shrinking glaciers and warming poles, this river will still be cold enough in July for the rainbow trout to hatch their eggs. Attention to the earth is one way of noticing climate change, and being friends with a place is one route to begin working on its behalf. Another way is to imagine. One of the elements of Johanna Stoberock's work I admire is her ability to reimagine sites of ecological terror as magical, as in her passages of the island where all the garbage goes in her novel Pigs. From a distance, sometimes the island looked like a whale. Its northern half was a tail, its southern half was a head. The clouds above were the imperfect umbrella of a spout. This is not to say that in her lucid prose, Johanna erases the horrors. Instead, she isolates them, piles of the world's garbage, which 4 children are responsible for feeding to 6 pigs, all of them's orphans, garbage themselves. Meanwhile, adults trip around in stilettos, drinking martinis. In Aimee Nezhukumatathil's World of Wonders, she writes about adult bodies too. But in her essay, Red-Spotted Newt, the adult body knows to follow its own homing instinct like the newt. She tells us how these amphibians find their way by aligning with the Earth's electromagnetic field, because the newts have a ferromagnetic mineral in their bodies, and that, combined with their incredible capacity to memorize sun and starlight patterns to return to their original pond waters, make them animals on par with salmon. Nezhukumatathil writes of her own homing instinct and how it is complicated by a range of factors. American racism, the cold home pond, the pull towards something familiar, relearning the self who has been fractured by assimilation. And she tells us that we can re-find that wonder by paying close attention to the creatures who live here with us. Attention and gratitude are related to one another. In Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, she asks us to imagine raising children in a culture in which gratitude is the first priority. And in Gathering Moss, she tells us mosses are small and that she finds the language of microscopic description compelling in its clarity. Reading her work, we hear the music of language marching along its little trail in each sentence, gathering gratitude. Reading her work, as in reading Nezhukumatathil and Stoberock, we feel again wonder and imagination, closer to the animals, plants, and microbacteria that sustain us and one another on a planet where we must do more than just shout facts at one another. The facts are no doubt important, but so is listening to the birds and the people whose stories bring us closer to knowing, through imagination, to believing we are related, because we are. Tonight, these 3 authors will show us in some way a path toward hope. I'll introduce each of them with brief bios before they read, and then we'll have a conversation. We're so glad you're here. Johanna Stoberock is the author of the novels Pigs and City of Ghosts, the 2019 recipient of the Artists Trust Gar LaSalle Storyteller Award, 2016 runner-up for the Calvino Prize for Fiction, and a 2012 Jack Straw Fellow. Johanna has received residencies at the Corporation of Yaddo, Vermont Studio Center, and the Malay Colony. She lives in Walla Walla and teaches at Whitman College. Please welcome Johanna Stoberock.
Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you, Get Lit, for having me here this evening. I'm so grateful to be sharing a Zoom space with these writers that I admire so much and whose work teaches so much about how to shape a new relationship with the natural world. Pigs uses a fabulous premise to think about issues of environmental and social responsibility. It takes place on an island that serves as a repository for the entire world's garbage. It follows the lives of 4 children who are responsible for gathering up that garbage and feeding it to a herd of giant, magical, insatiable pigs. It's a perfect system. The world doesn't have to think about the trash that it creates. The pigs can make anything thrown away disappear. If they occasionally snap off a child's finger in the process, so be it. Nobody thinks about the children, and the children have never been able to imagine a life that's different from the one that they know. But one day, a boy washes to shore in a barrel. And when the children try to decide whether he's garbage meant to be fed to the pigs or another child just like them, the story gets going. So I thought what I'd do this evening is read first from the very beginning of the novel, just to give you a sense of the setting and tone of its world. And then read several very short sections that are scattered throughout. And I think that the reading will take about 10 minutes. The pigs ate everything. Kitchen scraps, bitter lettuce from the garden, the stale and sticky contents of lunchboxes kids brought home from school, toenail clippings, hairballs pulled up from the drain, After the pigs were done, there weren't even any teeth left over, not even any metal from cavities filled long ago. They lived in a pen out back. The land was rocky but spacious, and the pen had been tucked in a corner out of sight for more years than any of the children could remember. It was made out of wood, gray splintered boards nailed together in a haphazard way. Every 5 feet, the wood was anchored by posts. When you stood by the fence, the pigs lumbered over, grunting, and stuck their snouts out between the rickety slats. It wasn't always that they expected food. Sometimes they just wanted their snouts scratched. Sometimes they just grunted happily and settled back down in the shade. There were 6 of them. They never fought. They seemed to smile when you approached, but you had to be quick. If you brought a bucket of slop and poured it out too slowly without moving your hand away, you never knew what could happen. Louisa was missing a finger. Not an important one, just her left hand pinky where she hadn't moved away quickly enough one hot summer afternoon when she was feeding them shoes. It was summer every afternoon there, soft and lazy and slow. The pinky came off in one clean bite before she even realized what was happening. She left with a feeling of shame, like it had been her fault the pig grabbed her finger. She wrapped her hand in her skirt and kept her mouth shut, and the stub didn't start hurting until she lay down for the night. The land was actually an island. The island was surrounded by water that glinted green in the sun and clouded to gray in the shade. Some might have let the pigs run free, feral among the scrubby bushes. The pigs could have rooted happily for mushrooms or truffles, found entire brambles of berries to eat, and maybe left the children alone. They could have gobbled up the entire world's detritus without anyone's help. But the grown-ups preferred the pigs confined. They preferred the relative safety of the fence. Louisa had lived on the island forever, or for as long as she could remember, which was the same as forever. There were other children too. Andrew, who sang in his sleep and had straw-colored hair. Mimi, who was older, or at least taller than the rest, and who liked to pretend she knew much more about the world than anyone else, and who couldn't grow her hair long no matter how hard she tried. There was even a toddler. They called her Natasha. Her head was covered with loose blonde curls. She couldn't have been more than 3, and she giggled every time she heard the grunting of the pigs. They were all afraid of the gray water, of the sea in a mood of despair. It wrapped the island like a scarf made of grief. It made you choke with tears to touch it. It didn't take long for Louisa's finger to heal into a nice, neat stump. She rubbed it sometimes and whispered to herself that it was time to grow up and stop being clumsy. It was her fault she'd lost a finger. The pigs were fast, but if she'd been a little more agile, they'd have snapped at air. She wondered what she'd tasted like. She hoped she tasted good, but not so good that the pig would want more. She tried to remember which one it was that had snapped at her, but even though she was pretty sure it was the one with black spots, she wasn't sure enough to say. Sometimes the children tested what the pigs would eat. The leather flaps of shoe tongues, the bent frames of glasses, Mardi Gras beads, tin cans, pistols, cap guns. There seemed to be no limit to their appetite. The children would stand a few feet away from the fence and toss whatever they were testing high into the air. The pigs moved with an unexpected grace, opening their long mouths and catching whatever came sailing down directly between their teeth. The pigs were remarkable. The children watched them with amazement, their own mouths open, their hands now empty, coming together of their own will to clap. Hubcaps, the tassels off bicycle handlebars, empty jars of mayonnaise, gone, all gone in seconds. The grown-ups on the island frowned at the children and never even pretended to help them with their chores. They drank espresso and smoked cigarettes and plugged their noses dramatically whenever the children got too close. As far as the children could tell, the grown-ups never cooked. When Natasha fell into the gray water and came out covered in spots and filled with an unquenchable thirst for a parent that even Mimi couldn't solve, the grown-ups flinched at the sight of her. "What are they here for?" Louisa said. Sometimes she thought, maybe we should just feed them to the pigs. Ships passed by from time to time, usually large cargo ships, but sometimes ocean liners. It was possible the island looked beautiful from a distance. When a ship edged onto the horizon, the children ran to the top of the highest rock and waved. They made Andrew take his shirt off, and Mimi circled it above her head. They didn't shout. They knew their voices weren't strong enough to carry all that way, and they didn't really want the grown-ups to hear them. Not that the grown-ups had ever shown they'd cared. But this was private, and they'd agreed to do it in silence. Only once, it seemed, that they'd been sighted, but the only difference it made was that a barrel washed up on shore instead of the usual junk. They spent an entire day trying to pry it open, and when they finally got inside, all they found was another child sleeping. His name was Eddie. So that's the beginning of the novel. The story continues from there. The children run into various forms of danger. The garbage keeps accumulating. A middle-aged castaway washes to shore and mistakenly thinks he's the children's savior. And throughout it all, the pigs continue eating in their ferocious and beautiful way. But the novel is also punctuated by a number of very short chapters that I used as a way to control its pacing, as a way to acknowledge my debt to other works of desert island literature, as a way to think carefully about what it means to have perspective, and to think in pieces about throwing the world away. And I'm going to read 2 of those short chapters. From a distance, the island looked so small that ocean liners moving past described it to their passengers as nothing but an unnamed, uncharted outcropping of rock. Cruise directors announced over loudspeakers that some people said it was the island where the sirens tried to lure sailors to their death. Listen closely, they said, and you'll hear something that sounds like a song. From time to time, a half-drunk divorcee jumped into the water and required rescue from irritated sailors. From time to time, passengers gathered on deck to sigh at the dark outline the island made against the orange setting sun. But nobody noticed the trails of refuse that formed a path over the water as the ship steamed on. It was official policy never to look back. It was official policy to believe the world stopped once it could no longer be seen. From a distance, seen from above, the island was shaped like a kidney. It had a wide curved side and a long indented side and 2 shorter, rounder ends. From sea level, it looked like a perfectly shaped mountain, all of it rising at the same angle to a peak at its very center. There wasn't any control room anywhere, no master plan for a magic island that served as the world's dump. It just was, and people just knew about it if they thought about it at all. And ships just brought their stuff there as if by instinct. Plastic bottles, because no one trusted tap water. Fur coats that were splashed with paint. Television screens that simply weren't flat enough. Weight loss and weight loss competitions. Mothers' wedding dresses that daughters had no interest in wearing. Toothpaste samples from the dentist. Love poems written by boyfriends long ago. The ships brought it and slipped it into the water when no one was watching, and once in the water, it vanished completely. Spools of film that no one remembered how to process, dolls with broken arms, income tax information that went back more than 7 years, half-eaten cupcakes, half-read novels, shrunken sweaters, chipped teacups. From the outside, with perspective, it all looked smooth and beautiful. The island's perfect peak, the sun forever setting or forever rising and never stuck at a punishing noonday height. But on the island itself, where even the idea of perspective did not exist, everything arrived in its particularity. From the island, it was the ships that seemed a single entity. What was discarded was unique. Who discarded it was not. And then finally, while a lot of the novel is dark, there are also a lot of moments of reprieve throughout, and I wanted to finish with one of those gentle moments. The children stayed down by the water while the sun set. They were still down by the water when the moon came out. On that island, when there were no clouds, the stars were always bright. It didn't matter if the moon was full and hogging half the sky. The stars formed a tight path over the crown of night, and Louisa easily dreamed of walking that path into heaven. When they finally stepped away from the water and headed back up to the hut, Natasha was clutching a starfish in her hand. Inside, she curled up on her mat, the starfish pressed to her cheek, and Louisa curled up next to her. She listened to the sleepy sighs that filled the room. She heard Otis's snoring, the heavy snoring of an adult so different from the delicate snoring of children. She heard the pigs sigh outside and faint trails of music drifting from the villa, and bordering it all, like a ribbon round the hem of a dress, she heard the gentle sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. That was amazing. I could go on about each one of these authors and their books tonight. I just have so much gratitude. Next, we have Aimee. Aimee Nezhukumatathil is the author of a book of nature essays, World of Wonders, In Praise of Fireflies, Whale Sharks, and Astonishments, and award-winning poetry collections, most recently Oceanic. Awards for her writing include fellowships from the Mississippi Arts Council, Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Poetry, National Endowment of the Arts, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She is a professor of English and creative writing in the University of Mississippi's MFA program. Welcome, Aimee Nezhukumatathil.
Hi, everybody. And Johanna, that was such an amazing reading. I wanted you to go on and more for that. I'm going to share my screen. It's such an honor to be here with you all. I just have one quick little thing to share you, and I'm going to read a selection from World of Wonder, but I wanted to share with you one of my favorite little birds. This is the potu, and you know, because it's 9 o'clock here in Central Time here in Oxford, Mississippi, I thought you'd get a kick out of what the potu looks like at night. I don't want anyone in the comments saying this is what I look like at night, hopefully. But here on the right, you'll see, it's just hard. I don't know, frankly, it's just hard to be in a bad mood when you look at the potu, I think. And then you can see what they look like in the daytime there on the right-hand side. That's a mama potu sleeping with her little baby. And I just wanted to give you that little happy visual today. I don't know about you, but it has been a hard, devastating news week. And I just thought if I could share something that would make people smile from the bird world, I would. I am going to read a selection from the chapter called Potu. And it starts like this. Sorry, let me clear this off. Okay. The potu. In Mississippi, summer means mosquito. It also means tomatoes. It means mosquito. It means peaches. It means humidity. It means strawberries. And it means mosquito. Mostly mosquito. I just counted 5 while sitting here on my deck, having a coffee at 7:30 in the morning. What I wouldn't do to have a little potu bird or 3 in my backyard to catch those bloodthirsty beasties. Alas, the potu only resides in Central and North America, where it gobbles up said mosquitoes and termites. When it's fully grown, potus are a little over a foot tall with thick necks and giant yellow eyes that look like they've just witnessed a glass-spattered car crash. Their toes and tarsi are a brilliant yellow too, but it's the traffic light eyes that people remember the most. Some refer to this bird as little more than a flying mouth and eyes, but potus are pretty much masters of disguise in the humid jungles of the Southern Hemisphere. Potus are nocturnal and so confident of their camouflaging skills, they just sleep right out in the open daylight. They close their giant eyes, tilt their heads towards the tree, and position their cryptic feathers to resemble a broken tree branch that even the sharpest eye struggles to discern what is tree and what is bird. Only a feather ruffle of wind betrays their otherworldly stillness. Even when they are hungry, they simply wait for insects to fly close and then dart out and return to their home branch with their catch. Now, potus are one of the few birds that never build a nest. Males and females take turns warming a single white egg with purple spots settled in the divot of a tree branch. When the baby is born, its feathers are pure white, and when it gets too large to safely hide under a parent, it learns how to freeze just so to resemble a patch of white mushrooms. Now, for a bird famous for its stoic stillness, the potu's call would sound comical if it didn't sound so scary. If your eyes were closed, you'd never imagine it came from such an austere-looking creature. The call is what you'd get if you combined a tiger roar with a frog croak, if both animals were in severe gastrointestinal distress. For example, if I was in a Brazilian rainforest and heard this cry, I might imagine it was going to be my last day on this planet. That's how chilling and terrifying the potu cry is. Stephen Hilty's book, Birds of Venezuela, describes it as a fairly loud, gruff, bwah. Can't even do this. Bwah. Descending somewhat like the retching sound of a human, unquote. In other words, it's the stuff of nightmares. Perhaps the reason the potu leads such a motionless, solitary life is to balance its audacious call. There's a time for stillness, but who hasn't also wanted to scream with delight at being outdoors, to simply announce themselves, I'm here, I exist. Like the potu, I grew up wanting to blend in my case, with blonde counterparts. And why would I know anyone else? Why would I know anything else? I felt most seen in my childhood, not by any television shows or movies, but rather when I was in the outdoors, in forests or fields, by lake or ocean. I learned how to be still by watching birds. If I wanted to see them, I had to mimic their stillness, to move slow in a world that wishes us brown girls to move fast. I learned how to call cardinals and have whole conversations with them when I was 6. One of the earliest presents I can remember getting from my father is a cardinal-shaped whistle. If I filled it with water and blew into the plastic straw of its exaggerated tail, I could mimic. Okay, right here, I need to point out, I'm gonna mimic the call of the cardinal that I know. And I just wanna say this in advance so I don't get bird-splained in the comments. I know I'm not a scientist, I am not an ornithologist, but I promise you, I have witnesses that know that I can bring cardinals to my yard by this call, okay? So I'm aware of that. I don't need to be cardinal-splained, anything like that. So here we go. I learned that I could mimic the distinctive hurdy-gurdy, 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 gurdy-gurdy, hurdy, hurdy-gurdy, hurdy-gurdy, gurdy. That call of the cardinal so well, I could bring cardinals to the edges of our yard, wondering just what it was I was saying to them. Eventually, I stopped using the whistle and I learned how to do it on my own. First in Ohio while in college and in graduate school, when I thought no one might be hanging around the oval, the main lawn on campus. And second in Wisconsin, where I lived for a year post-graduate school. during long walks around Lake Mendota, when I would try to wrestle out a line that vexed me for what would eventually become my first book. Birds have always been an easy audience for me, and I hope I've been an easy, if sometimes confusing, audience for them with my paltry replies. Now, all of these conversations were a secret I kept even from my husband until one late spring day when he came home from work early, only to find me in the backyard having a lengthy discussion with a riled up red cardinal and his mate. Both birds, perched just above my head, had seemed to enjoy our talk, but then their metallic chirps sounded more and more insistent, and I have to admit I must have answered back a little glibly, and then poof, they burst from the tree and ended our talk right then and there. When I turned around, my husband's mouth was frozen open. Reader, we had been married for over a decade, and this was the first time he'd ever seen me do this. I'm certain it's not any magic in my mouth, no special twist of tongue that only I have unlocked. But I think it's the quiet way you settle into the crook of a tree, the still and slow down of your heart in a world that wants us to be quick and move on to the next thing. The secret in talking to birds is in the steadiness of each limb as you make your way into their territory, in the deliberateness of each movement and bend of tree branch and grass blade. And just like the potu, who was rewarded for her stillness by having her lunch practically fly right into her mouth, perhaps you could try a little tranquility, find a little tenderness in your quiet. Who knows what feathered gifts await? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aimee. That was really beautiful. Yes, I'm trying not to do the thing that teachers do where you say something to each person. So I'm going to move on to Robin. We'll have a conversation later. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation. She's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, and her first book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, which was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Robin lives in Syracuse, where she is a distinguished professor of environmental biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both Indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals of sustainability. Please help me welcome Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Bonjour, miigwech. Thank you for those kind words. And oh, you know, it's late here in upstate New York, and this feels like being read bedtime stories too. Pig Islands and potus. Oh my gosh, I just want this to go on and on. Thank you for those beautiful readings, and thank you for inviting me to get lit. When I heard about your theme of creativity in climate crisis, you know, I really was trying to think about what would be the best thing to share with you. And I began thinking about, in fact, a very old story. And what I'm going to share with you comes from a very old Potawatomi, Anishinaabe story. Our people are Great Lakes people. And as you'll hear in this story, that has not always been our homeland. We've moved around a bit. Potawatomi is sort of the anglicized way of saying Bodwe-wadme, which is the people of the fire. And this notion of the fire has so many meanings for us. It of course refers to physical fire, to ishkole, that cares for us, right? It also refers to eras of history. When we talk about a fire that is meant to be a a time when our people's council fire was in a particular place and circumstance. And we also think about that fire, and when we talk about ourselves as people and keepers of the fire, if keepers of the spiritual fire that is housed in all of us. And so the piece I'm going to read to you comes from a chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass about keeping fire and the ways that our people did that in all of those dimensions. And at the end, you'll hear, one of the way that we build a fire is really important. And it's not with a lighter and it's not with a match, but the sacred fires are always built by hand. And so that is what you'll hear a tad of in a bit. So I'll say at the outset, thank you for listening. It's such an honor to read with you all tonight. In the time on the other side of the circle, what we might call a long time ago, in the era of the first fire, the lodges of the Anishinaabe looked out to the Atlantic. Among our relatives, the Dawn people, there were some among them who could see over that horizon and foretold that the Anishinaabe must move to the west, or else the people and our sacred fire would be extinguished in the changes that were to come to Turtle Island. They didn't want to go, to leave their relatives and their home place, but accepted their responsibility to safeguard the future of the people. So it was agreed that some would load the traveling canoes while some would stay behind. They were counseled to search until they found the place where the food grows on the water. Their journeys we know from the telling of the migration stories. Many generations carried the fire along the St. Lawrence River, past the thundering water and into the Great Lakes, establishing settlements along the way, always moving, as the prophets predicted, to the west. And eventually they came to the place that had been foretold, where the food grows on the water, and established our new homelands in the country of wild rice. The people lived well for a long time under the care of maples and birches, our relatives, the sturgeon and beaver, eagle and loon. And after many generations there, prophets again arose among the people who spoke of the coming of ships from the east, who brought the possibilities of a brotherhood of knowledge. They also brought the possibility of great destruction. And so it came to be. When time moves in a circle, prophecy becomes history. We all know the story that the prophets foretold. They warned the people of the black robes and the black books that will nearly break the hoop of the nation. People became separated from their homelands and from each other. Forbidden by law to practice our own religion, an ancient worldview was nearly lost. Forbidden to speak our languages, a universe of knowing vanished in a generation. The land was fragmented, the old ways were blowing away in the wind, and even our plant and animal relatives began to turn their faces away from us. The time was foretold when the people would lose their way and their purpose in life, and the sacred fire was in grave danger. This too, we know, has come to pass. And yet, even after everything, there's something that remains, a coal that will not be extinguished. At that time of darkness, they say a prophet appeared with a distant light in his eyes, and this young man came to the people with a message. He comforted our ancestors with the knowledge that in the time of the seventh fire, a new people would emerge, charged with sacred purpose. Their task will be hard. It will demand all the courage that the surrounding generations can share with them. These people of the seventh fire will come to a place where the long road of the people divides. One of the paths is soft and green with new grass. You could walk barefoot there. The other path is scorched black. The cinders are sharp and would cut your feet. The ancestors look to them from the flickering light of distant fires. The people of the seventh fire, standing at the crossroads when life itself hangs in balance, and they do not walk forward. The teaching of the seventh fire is that seventh fire people must turn around and walk back along the ancestors' path and gather up all the fragments that lay scattered along the trail. Fragments of land, tatters of language, bits of songs, the stories, sacred teachings, lost plants, lost animals, all that was lost along the way, they are to go back and retrieve. Our elders have said that we live today in the time of the seventh fire. We are the ones the stories foretold who would bend to the task of putting things back together. The fork in the road stands atop a hill. I can see it so clearly, as if from a high place. And to the left, the path is soft and green. And even from a dream distance, the dew sparkles like the cold stars above. The path to the right is pavement at first. It looks like an ordinary sidewalk. Its surface deceptively smooth. And after you choose it, just as it drops over the line of sight, the pavement is buckled and deformed by heat, and then broken into a landscape of cinders and jagged shards. In the valleys below, I imagine the people of the seventh fire walking toward that crossroads with everything that they have gathered up. They're carrying in their bundles a change in worldview, not so they can return to the vanished time of our ancestors, but to find the tools that allow us to go forward. So much has been forgotten, but it is not lost as long as the land endures and we cultivate people who have the humility and ability to listen and learn from the land. For the people are not alone. All along the path are the birds and the turtles and the bear and the deer, the fish, all of the non-human people stand beside us, helping. What knowledge the people have forgotten is remembered by the land. After all, they want to live too. And the path is lined with all the world's people in all colors from the medicine wheel, red, white, black, and yellow, who understand the choice ahead, who share a vision of respect and reciprocity, of fellowship with the more than human world. Men carrying fire, women carrying water to reestablish balance, to renew the world. Friends and allies all, they're falling in step, forming a great long line, headed for the barefoot path. From the crossroads, there's another road visible in the distance. And from that high place, I see the rooster tails of dust thrown up as they speed ahead with their engines roaring. They're driving drunk on oil. They don't see the children. They don't see the turtles. Blindfolded by dollar bills, they think they're the only ones on the road. Bullies swagger along the road, carrying cans of gasoline and a lit torch. I worry who will get to the crossroads first. What does it mean to be people of the seventh fire? To walk back along the ancestral road and pick up what was left behind? We have to be careful to distinguish what is truly medicine for the living earth and what is deception. None of us can recognize every piece, let alone carry it all. We need each other to each pick up a song, a word, a story, a tool, a ceremony, and put it in our bundles, not for ourselves, but for the ones yet to be born, for all our relations. Collectively, we gather the wisdom of the past for a vision of the future, a worldview shaped by mutual flourishing, knowing that what's good for the land is good for the people. It's said that if the people choose the green path, then all the world's people, from the four sacred directions, people can go forward together to light the eighth and final fire of peace and brotherhood, and forge the great nation that was foretold long ago. What will it take to light that eighth fire? With rare exceptions, fires don't make themselves. In making a handmade fire, so much depends on the plants. 2 pieces of cedar, the bow of striped maple, the bowstring twined of dogbane. So much depends on the body, each joint at the right angle, the motion of the drill against the board, so that their movement against each other becomes friction, heat building and building until it forms a coal and falls under its own weight onto the waiting tinder. So much depends on the tinder, the flyaway bits of cattail fluff, the shreds of yellow birch bark, torn like confetti where a coal will be laid. So much depends on the gift of Shkatagan, the firekeeper fungus, the holder of the spark that cannot be extinguished. So much depends on the air, the passage through the tinder nest, strong enough to make it glow, not so strong to blow it out, breath of wind and not of man, embracing bark and dust, propagating heat on heat until smoke plumes billow in sweet fragrance, light erupts and you hold in your hand a fire. In seeking the Shkatagan of the forest and the Shkatagan of the spirit, we ask for open eyes and open minds, hearts open enough to embrace our more than human kin, a willingness to engage intelligences not our own. We'll need to trust in the generosity of the good green earth to provide this gift and trust in people to reciprocate. I don't know how the eighth fire will be lit, but I do know that we can gather the tinder that will nurture the flame, that we can be Shkatagan to carry the fire as it was carried to us. Is this not a holy thing, the kindling of this fire? So much depends on the spark. Aho miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you so much for that barefoot path and for encouraging us to be that spark. That was really beautiful. Thank you to Johanna. Thank you to Aimee. These readings were really tremendous. And one of you said you feel like you're being read bedtime stories. I think we're all feeling that, but we're also feeling some urgency, right? And I imagine our audience is really excited to hear you speak a bit in conversation. So I'm going to begin with a question for all 3 of you, and then we can transition to some audience questions that will come in over the Q&A, and to asking questions of one another if you'd like to. So when I ask the question, you can unmute yourself and begin speaking, and then the next person can jump in when you're ready. That's how we'll do that. So this event was framed as creativity in the climate crisis. And I know we're all acutely aware of the crisis, and it isn't just climate related. We cannot separate climate justice from racial justice, from social justice. These things are entwined with one another. I'm picking up here on the end of Robin's reading. Can you all speak to the ways that your work, both on the page and in person, engages with grassroots justice movements? How do we open the eyes? How do we open the minds? And what will it take to begin that spark? And how are you doing it with your work?
Maybe I could start just because I have a brief answer, and then other people can just jump in. I love that question, Maya. I think it's so beautiful because it asks us, how do we start? And I think I would say start small, because it can be overwhelming to think, okay, how do I tackle this entire movement? How do I join in? How do I contribute? But I think if you go back to kind of remembering what we all love about the outdoors, start small, be it a pond in your grandmother's backyard, or the swoop and bend of a tree that you used to climb and jump into a creek for. Then maybe learn about that area, learn all you can about it. I think it's really behooves us to be curious about other things besides humans. And I would say start small. Like, so for example, I know especially early in the pandemic, when so many of us were inside and it was hard to feel creative or hard to feel like you're doing anything of help. I think one thing that you can do is to look out your window. I've said this before several times. If you don't know the names of clouds, if you don't know the names of about, 10, start small, 5 birds that live within, a 10-mile radius of you, that's one place to start. Start where you are, meet the movement where you are. And then hopefully that will inspire you to say, oh, XYZ is affecting the wood thrush that lives near me. What can I do for that? And these factories are dumping into the river that's affecting these particular salamanders. What can I do for that? So to start small. Obviously, if you have the means and the energy, start big as you want. But for those of us who are feeling overwhelmed, I think start small and start with what you love. But I'm curious to see what other people would have to add to that.
Well, I would celebrate that Aimee, absolutely. That attention, right? Using that gift of attention that brings us to wonder, that brings us to love the world. And you do that so beautifully.
Thank you.
In thinking about your question, Maya, of the way that all of those pieces fit together, a piece that feels important to me in the time of climate urgency that you're invoking is to start small, to start with our own thinking and our own worldview, to question this default worldview that we've been given. This notion that the world is our property, that birds and rivers and trees are our property, that they're natural resources. That's the default Western worldview, isn't it? That it all belongs to us and it's all just stuff. What I really want to try to do to activate a different kind of imagination and consciousness is to at least help people know that there are other ways to see the world, that this default option of the Western worldview, of the material worldview, is not the only one. That we could choose to see the world as gift. We could choose to think about the world full of not just other entities or ecosystem services, but of persons, of relatives. We could choose that. And, I so appreciate the notion of we can't change, no one of us can propel systemic change, but when we change how we think, we change how we behave. And I think it's contagious. And so I would, urge that notion of how can we start to decolonize our minds and begin to think differently about the world, not that we live in, but that we want to live in.
Thanks, Robin and Aimee. Those are really helpful for me. I guess one thing that I was thinking about while I was writing Pigs was about paying attention. Robin talked about that, and Aimee did too. And so paying attention in particular to ways in which I'm spending my money to wreck the environment. And so making choices in terms of what I purchase at the grocery store based on that, rather than based on convenience or based on what my kids want me to get or what have you. So for example, not getting the peanut butter that has like the strange plastic wrapper around the lid that it doesn't seem to even need. Instead, get the peanut butter that doesn't have it, that kind of thing. And before the pandemic started, that was working really well for me. I was, the bringing of plastic into my house had dropped enormously. I was extraordinarily intentional about the waste that our family created. And then when the pandemic hit, it became much harder to do that. The grocery store no longer allowed us to bring cloth bags with us, et cetera. And so at that point, that caused an even bigger, I think, adjustment in thought. So the adjustment of, well, if I can't change in these convenient ways, what other kinds of changes can I make that are not as easy to make? So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about this year. But the other thing that I was really trying to do with all of the garbage in Pigs was find a way to love even that stuff that is thrown away. So like even that junk that is created that shouldn't be created or shouldn't be discarded, like what is there in there that I can embrace and love and see in particularity? And somehow that seems important to me too.
Thanks, Johanna. Thanks, Aimee, and thanks, Robin. Thanks for those really great answers. There are some questions coming in over the Q&A, so I want to get to some of those audience questions. And just as a follow-up, there was a comment: do we have enough time to start small? I feel like we need to heed Baldwin's call to go for broke. And I think that I see all of you doing that in the ways that you engage. Johanna's talking about the family lifestyle, and Aimee and Robin teaching people to pay attention to so Amy's saying what's right outside your window and learning those birds, and then figuring out how you can stop, the pollutants and the toxins in your local rivers. And then Robin teaching people to actually go into the field, right, and study at a very, very close level. Before we started here, Robin was talking about her classes and her students. And so I'm just thinking about the ways that all of you are doing that work in a daily way. But I want to move into an audience question this is from Namrata. How did you learn to tell stories? I think that's a really beautiful question and something we don't get to hear a lot from authors. So how did you learn to tell stories?
I love that question so much. And you're right. I don't think, gosh, I've been doing events since August, almost nonstop. Nobody has kind of asked me that. And I think that's such a gorgeous question to ask a writer. I would say I said it in my book. I've said it in my collections of poetry. The first poets, the first storytellers I ever, and they would cringe maybe a little bit, but the best and the most entertaining and the most riveting storytellers were always my parents. They're the ones who instill that sense of wonderment and curiosity about the planet. I was quite literally on the edge of my seat. Just, we didn't have literature in the house. It makes it so sad. I'm an English professor now, but I didn't, they always made sure we had books at the library, and I didn't have traditional bedtime stories, but just telling stories of India and the Philippines was just so incredibly, they used metaphor, they used music, they used repetition, all these kind of techniques that I now teach in poetry. They would never consider them, they work in the medical field, they would never consider themselves a poet. My mom is the best metaphor maker I have ever heard still. And I kind of just learned by being a rapt little girl at every time she told stories of the Philippines or of the ocean. And, I grew up in Chicago and Arizona and Kansas, all these landlocked places. So anytime she talked about the ocean, and my father in Kerala, India, talking about recycling, and, it wasn't called being green there. That's just how they live, is they reuse things from the land and try not to hurt and damage the land that they have been gifted, as Robin says. That was, I don't know, that was just something they knew, I think too, that I would listen when they would employ rhythm and music and metaphor, sometimes scaring me to action, but they still remain. I'm so lucky that they're still around. And they're retired in Central Florida now, and just hearing them, checking in with them daily on their garden reports, I wish I could just take down notes of the metaphors. My mom was telling me a snake was trying to steal her blueberries. What can she do? But she gave a good look at the snake, and the snake walked away, is what she said. And I just love that. I've been pondering that phrase all day long, and I heard that 9 a.m. this morning. So I don't know, it's a big answer, but really my parents taught me metaphor.
I want to credit my mom and dad too. My great storytellers of mostly family stories, and they took us to the library every single week. That was just a family pilgrimage, that we would come home with more books than we could carry. So I think I learned in that way. And my parents are both 90 this year, and my dad started a little writing group in the place where he lives, and is still telling stories and encouraging others to, and that totally inspires me. And this, I'm trying to think about how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm a crazy person. But no, Aimee, I don't have to worry about that, because you're talking to cardinals. So you'll totally get this. I feel like I learned storytelling from attention to the natural world. Because there's so many stories there. It's not that we just look at that salamander or those berries as an object, but they're embedded in the story of their place, and who's with them and who's visiting them and how they change through time. And so I think that certainly informed my storytelling, is the storytelling that comes from that deep attention to look beyond the thing to the meaning and its set of relationships.
I also have to credit my parents. My dad, when I was little, I was always afraid to fall asleep on my own. And so he would sit next to me and hold my hand and tell me stories about when he was a little boy. And so I still have those stories in my head all the time. And then he grew up in Germany and didn't really have books a lot when he was a kid. And so he really loved reading to me and my sister at night, discovering the books that we were also falling in love with. And so his favorite book was Trumpet of the Swan, and we were also big fans of that. So, and then we also went to the library all the time. But I think that another thing that really helped me was that when I was in my early 20s, I used to practice visualization meditation, and like this, just a practice of conjuring up an image, holding it in front of you, and then watching it move. And I think that there's something about fiction writing that operates as a visual medium in that same way, and that learning to hold that image and then move it, it was a big part of my learning how to be a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. That was great. All three of you giving props to parents and caregivers, and that caregivers sometimes being the natural world caring for you, right? The rain and the grass and the creatures that teach us how to tell stories. I want to transition to a question about storytelling, and this is actually from Ashley, one of our audience members, and this is to Johanna, and then I'll have a follow-up that's for both Aimee and Robin. So Johanna, you mentioned interspersing your novel's chapters with short passages as a nod to a tradition of desert island literature. Can you talk more about that tradition, what you borrowed from it, and how you expanded its horizons?
Thanks, Ashley. That's a really great question. So I should say that I started writing Pigs. I just kind of sat down one day and I had its first line rattling around in my head, "The pigs ate everything." And I just kind of went from there. And its world just kind of like snapped into place right away. The characters that were there, the system of garbage accumulating, etc. And so I just wrote and I wrote, and then all of a sudden I started thinking, like, what is this thing that I'm writing? It just feels so strange. Like it's fun to write and I'm super interested in it, but it just doesn't feel like I don't know where to place it. And so when I was kind of trying to figure out what it was and how to place it, I started thinking like, oh, well, maybe this island is, you know, like Zachary Mason's The Lost Books of the Odyssey. Like maybe it's just one of those islands that, you know, Odysseus visited that we just never hear about. Like maybe that's what it is, like the pig garbage island. And so I started thinking about that. And actually one of the characters' name is Otis. And I originally called him that because I was thinking like, well, maybe he's like this Odysseus figure. But it turns out that Otis elevators, that elevators are some of the very few things that are not thrown away because it's just so hard for them to be taken out of buildings. And so it's much better to repair them. So anyway, that was a nice little thing that happened with that. But so that was kind of the first, you know, island literature that I was thinking about. And then I kept writing and then I started thinking like, oh no, this is kind of like Lord of the Flies, but I haven't read that since I was in 7th grade. And so then I had to go back and think like, okay, well, yeah, it is, there's some similarities. And so I can't write this book without also acknowledging that. And then I started thinking about, you know, like Peter Pan, that also takes place on an island. And, oh, the television series Lost, like anybody who reads this is going to think like, oh, this is another Lost. And so I just felt like I had to like start thinking about what those books do, like what kind of pressure happens in an enclosed space, a place that's enclosed by water, where all of the action has to kind of like pool into together and intensify. And then also acknowledge that the book doesn't take place in a vacuum, and that whether or not I was consciously drawing on those other works, they were in it. Yeah.
Thanks for that really great answer, Johanna. And thanks for the really good question, Ashley. Ashley has a follow-up question. This is for Aimee and Robin. Relatedly to Aimee and Robin, or all the writers, to what extent did you feel compelled to draw on existing forms and traditions to write about our contemporary climate crisis? And or to what extent did you feel the need to seek out new forms or bend traditions as you wrote your books?
I could respond to that in all honesty, because all my training is as a botanist and a biologist. So I don't have a literary tradition to draw upon in a sense. So so it doesn't, except that I will say that I have such reverence for old traditional stories because I'm deeply fascinated by what makes a story last. You know, when I hear stories in our culture that we know are thousands of years old, like, wow, what is it? What's the magic in that? And so there's a way in which I can't say I'm inspired by them because I don't understand the answer to that question of what it is that makes them last. But my inquiry about that, I'm sure, colors the way I try to tell stories that will last.
That's such a good question too. And Robin, you're right. I very similarly look to, you know, for me, I look to Greek myth, Filipino myth to see like what are the commonalities of those stories that have lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. And it is interesting to think about. I don't know if I think my answer changes, I think really every year on that. But one thing I would say is, you know, I'm usually a poet. And so even this business of trying to write a proposal for a book was like, it gives me the hives just thinking about all that kind of stuff, agents and, you know, all that's not how I normally operate. But one of the common questions I would get from editors is what are some books similar to yours? And I just I didn't know, like, what are the comp books? I couldn't answer that. And I kind of wish they'd do away with that question because what I wanted to do was kind of, you know, I read so much literature from the environment that was primarily white, elderly male, adventure tales, almost none of them, and, you know, and beautiful writing that very much moved me. Annie Dillard, living writers like Terry Tempest Williams, scientists like Rachel Carson, all of that is important. I'm not negating any of that. But when I got to the end of the book, nobody had brown skin, you know, nobody. So it was you know, growing up in the 80s, 70s, it's almost as if, I mean, and I read so much. I read everything that I could get my hands on in the library. About the outdoors, the different animals and plants that I loved. And it almost was if, you know, the publishing world was telling me Asian Americans don't hang out outside. And I could not, so one, that made me feel lonesome as all get out. And two, I just knew somewhere in my bones that could not possibly be true when hearing the stories from my mother and my father that, you know, so many people in India and the Philippines, basically on the other side of this planet, are outdoors all the time. So that I point that back to the publishers and to the teachers and professors of who gets to tell their stories of being outside and who doesn't, and why, you know, like it's 2021, it's not 1951 anymore. And what I wanted to do is kind of give a call back to those science texts and things that I grew up loving. And the designers at Milkweed were just so amazing. I would be remiss if I didn't show, for those people on YouTube and Facebook, this is an illustration of an axolotl, my favorite amphibian. And it's by a super talented illustrator named Fumi Nakamura, who's Asian American. And I just was I very much wanted Asian American names to be on a book that celebrates the outdoors. I wanted to say Nakamura Nezhukumatathil, we are here. I had no expectations because I had 20 plus years of being told, no, your story doesn't matter, or, you know, your kinds of stories don't sell. Another word that makes me cringe. So the only thing I can do, and I would say this to anybody out there in the audience who is a creator, is I just kind of pushed forward and said, but I love this. And what Robin said before, I think that love and that excitement and that enthusiasm is you can't help but not be contagious, you know, on that. And also, I think there was just no other vessel that I could think of. I didn't want to follow the blueprints of people who were so ready to put environmental writers in a box. Where were the writers that were, number one, Asian American, but also had crushes on people, when I was younger? Now I'm married, but where are the environmental writers who actually love their husbands, who love having children, don't want them to, don't want them to go away, that kind of thing, who actually loves spending time with them, who also loves fashion and music and makeup and pop culture. There was no format for me to fit in. So I had to make kind of my own in that way, that you could love the environment and be kind of this science nerd and also love, Madonna and Michael Jackson and roller skating too. You didn't have to be one or the other. So it was scary. I'm not gonna lie. It was absolutely scary. And I had tons of editors who said, no, I just don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with you. Like, there's not enough sadness in your story. There's not enough trauma. I got that a lot. They would be willing to publish me if I had trauma in my life, but they wouldn't be willing to publish me if I'm singing about joy and wonderment. And that's also strange. And we see that as recently as, the violence that we saw in Atlanta, that I think there's a direct correlation of people who'd be willing to consider Asian American women as disposable, who are fine with making fun of so-called strange sounding Asian names, and people who also don't care about learning names of birds or learning names of native plants there's just it's such a gross pride of being happy to be ignorant of other people and other plants and animals. And it's so gross to me. There's just no other way for it. It's so gross that you could pat yourself on the back and say, us first, America first, when everything in nature tells you that's unnatural. It's not us first and put us first. In nature, we are told how much every living thing depends on each other and that we need to help and care for each other. So when you hear anybody say us first, us, that is the most unnatural thing. And it should be a tell when you hear somebody making fun of a culture or a strange name. That should be on them. Like, how sad that you don't know other cultures. How sad that you don't know that there are other things besides your little hometown, that exists, that kind of thing. I don't know. Clearly I can go on and on, but I won't, except for the fact that one of the greatest sadnesses I think that's going on right now is how much pride people seem to have in being ignorant, just plain out ignorant, and wanting to be so unnatural in putting themselves first, putting one culture first and not, and that is absolutely not what the plant world does. That is absolutely not what animals do. So it's very gross to me and very disturbing that there are some people who are doing what I think is very unnatural, unnatural ways of being.
Thank you, Aimee. That was fantastic.
Sorry, I just went on, but it just struck a nerve because I remember, feeling lonesome that there was no book that filled what I wanted to do. And I would just say that as an encouragement. If whatever story you're trying to write or to get on the page, if you've not seen anything like it, don't let that stop you. That should be a signal to you that we need that story. Why should we be writing the same story over and over again? I want to read about the outdoors and have that represented by what our planet actually looks like, So hopefully that's an encouragement to don't be discouraged if what you want to put out there doesn't have hasn't been done already before. That should be a signal to you to keep doing what you're doing.
I love that. Signal to you to keep doing what you're doing. And we have just a few more minutes left in this event. So I want to kind of wrap some of the questions that are coming in into one and ask each of the authors if you'd like to talk just a little bit about what you're reading or what those urgent voices are that you're hearing in the world right now that you wish would be celebrated more or read more by this audience tonight, and just give a recommendation or some final thoughts on works that you think should be celebrated.
Someone else can go first.
I'll tell you what I'm reading. I mean, I read terribly. I mean, I just read terribly. I just have stacks and stacks of books. So the novel that I'm reading right now is Mona Awad's Bunny, which I just love. And I'm teaching a class on fairy tales right now, and it's really, I just love seeing what she has done with that. And she has a new book coming out, I think any day, that I'm super excited, called All's Well. And then I'm also slowly reading through Namwali Serpal's Stranger Faces. So reading essays as well. So those are two books that I have been turning to recently.
I would say that what's drawing me right now is my own sense of limitation about thinking about how the ideas of biomimicry in nature, thinking, if we take seriously the notion of land as teacher, that by paying attention, we will, learn different ways to live. I'm firmly grounded there, but where I find myself really faltering and looking to other writers is to how to bring that into the material world that we live in, particularly in economic realms. This economics is about what we value and what we exchange. And I've had so many folks say to me, well, how could I make the honorable harvest that you write about real in the world? How do I make a gift economy real in the world so that the stories that we're sharing find transformation in the world? And so I would say, a writer that has just intrigued me lately is Charles Eisenstein and his work on what he calls sacred economics, about how do we take these ideas of kinship with the natural world, this idea of the default option of land as property and land as capital. How do we replace that with a worldview that values kinship and the intrinsic value and wonder of the natural world? And so that interests me greatly, and his work has been really helpful for me in developing a vocabulary around that.
I love that, Robin, and especially about the mimicry aspect of what you just said, of learning different ways to be in this world from the animal world as well. Quick, so I'm, this is something brand new. I am the Sierra Club's first ever poetry editor for Sierra Magazine. So that is it's kind of overwhelming if I think about it too long, because my family has been members of the Sierra Club all my life. And to know that I'm helping usher in poetry into this magazine, knowing that John Muir started this way back in the 1800s is, yeah, I can't think about it too much. So I've been reading a lot of poetry, and one that I would recommend, this is Peach State by Adrienne Sue. And that just came out this month. She's a writer who's originally from Atlanta, Georgia. It's not environmental per se, but I have to say it because it is the most delicious book of poetry. The next time I teach a poetry workshop, I'm actually going to teach this book. It's like an ode and an homage to Asian American cooking in the South, particularly Chinese food. And if you even remotely love Chinese food the way I do, you will be drooling and wishing that restaurants would open up. It's just such a delight. There's like odes to lychee fruit, Peking duck, tea eggs. I mean, you will just be drooling. So I love that, you know, and a lot of times people think of Southern cooking as one thing, and people forget that Southern cooking is made up of so many different cultures and things like that. And I also wanted to mention, I'm reading something that's just knocking me out right now is I'm reading Thor Hansen's newest book. It's coming out. I don't know how many of you know Thor Hansen's work. He's a scientist, but he's written beautifully about feathers. So I would also recommend, if you're kind of stuck, his book is just called Feathers. It's such an exquisite book. It almost reads like a long section of poetry, but I can just fangirl about his writing so much. If you haven't read Feathers, pick that up. But his newest one, I'm in the process of reading it right now. It's going to be out, I want to say, this fall. And that's been bringing me delight. So Peach State, if you're in the mood for poetry, it is National Poetry Month after all, and anything by Thor Hansen.
Thank you again, Johanna, Aimee, and Robin, for those recommendations, for deepening our lexicon, for helping us expand our vocabularies and our reading lists. This has just been a really wonderful and enlightening evening, and we're all really grateful to the three of you for this event. Thank you to those of you in the audience, and I'm going to kick it back to Kate and Claire, who will wrap us up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you for facilitating such a fantastic conversation and for putting such care into tonight's introduction as well. And thank you again to Johanna, Aimee, and Robin for being here with us tonight. To say this was a special night feels like an incredible understatement. I'm just so grateful that we could provide this space for all of you to share such important and beautiful work with all of us. So thank you again for being here. And thank you to our audience at home for tuning in and for asking such thoughtful questions. You can learn more about all of these writers, check out other festival events, and donate to help support our program via our website, getlitfestival.org. We will see you tomorrow for another packed day of events. You'll get to see Aimee one more time at our live Milkweed Poets reading at 2 p.m. Pacific, featuring Aimee, Catherine Smith, Michael Kleber-Diggs, and Brooke Matson. And make sure to tune in for tomorrow night's live reading and conversation with Jess Walter and Essie Adujan starting at 7 p.m. Thank you again for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.